Strength did not arrive in a single night, dramatic and complete, the way it sometimes gets imagined by anyone looking for a shortcut to the same result. Getting stronger never happened overnight. Refusing to quit on the nights that actually mattered is what happened instead. That distinction matters because it removes the myth of a single turning point, replacing it with something far less glamorous but far more accurate. Most nights did not matter much individually. They passed, ordinary, unremarkable, contributing little on their own to whatever was eventually built. A few nights mattered enormously. The ones where stopping would have been easy, justified, completely understandable given everything working against continuing at that exact moment. Those specific nights are where the actual strength got built. Not through dramatic transformation, but through simple refusal repeated at exactly the moments it counted most. Recognizing which nights actually mattered required paying attention, staying present enough to notice when a moment carried more weight than the surrounding ordinary stretches. That attention paid off. Every refusal on a night that mattered added something permanent, something that compounded over time into whatever stands now, built entirely from those specific decisions rather than from any single dramatic overnight shift. This is where everything else gets built from. Not speed, not talent, just refusal, applied consistently, especially on the nights when refusing actually cost something significant. Talent opened the door. Kicking it down completely happened every single day after that. That sequence matters because it clarifies exactly where talent's contribution actually ends and something else entirely has to take over. An open door is not the same as a fully accessible space. It is simply an opening, narrow, requiring far more force to actually walk through completely and claim whatever exists on the other side. Talent provided that initial opening. It did nothing beyond that point, leaving everything else, every single day of effort required to actually move through and claim what was available to something separate from talent entirely. That something separate showed up daily, deliberately, applying force the original opening never provided on its own. This distinction matters because it removes talent from receiving credit it never actually earned beyond the initial moment of opportunity. What happened after the door opened was earned, repeatedly, through consistent effort that talent alone was never capable of producing on its own. That earning continues now, daily, regardless of how the original door happened to open in the first place.
Gifted people exist, undeniably, with natural advantages that make certain things come easier from the very beginning of any pursuit. Being the most gifted was never the case here. Being the last one still standing at 3 in the morning was. That distinction reframes the entire competition completely. Gifted people often assume their natural advantage carries them through every stretch, including the late, exhausting hours where advantage stops mattering nearly as much as sheer willingness to remain present. That assumption frequently fails them. Talent rarely survives exhaustion as well as stubborn refusal does, especially during the specific hours when almost everyone else has already gone home. Being present during those hours repeatedly, when gifted competitors had already decided the effort was not worth continuing, created an advantage that natural talent never actually provided. That advantage compounds. Every late hour survived while others left adds something that eventually outweighs whatever head start talent originally provided. This is the actual competition that matters most, not raw ability measured at the start. Endurance, measured specifically during the hours almost nobody else is willing to stay present for. Gifted people exist, undeniably, with natural advantages that make certain things come easier from the very beginning of any pursuit. Being the most gifted was never the case here. Being the last one still standing at 3 in the morning was. That distinction reframes the entire competition completely. Gifted people often assume their natural advantage carries them through every stretch, including the late, exhausting hours where advantage stops mattering nearly as much as sheer willingness to remain present. That assumption frequently fails them. Talent rarely survives exhaustion as well as stubborn refusal does, especially during the specific hours when almost everyone else has already gone home. Being present during those hours, repeatedly, when gifted competitors had already decided the effort was not worth continuing, created an advantage that natural talent never actually provided. That advantage compounds. Every late hour survived while others left adds something that eventually outweighs whatever head start talent originally provided. This is the actual competition that matters most, not raw ability measured at the start, endurance measured specifically during the hours almost nobody else is willing to stay present for.
Speed gets valued constantly, treated as though faster always means better, more impressive, more worthy of recognition than slower, steadier alternatives. Speed was never the requirement here. Never stopping moving was the only actual requirement that mattered. That distinction removes pressure that speed always creates, pressure to perform quickly rather than simply continuing consistently regardless of pace. Fast movement that eventually stops produces less over time than slow movement that simply never stops at all. That comparison rarely gets made honestly because speed looks impressive in the moment, while consistency looks unremarkable, easy to overlook precisely because it lacks the dramatic visual impact speed always provides. Choosing consistency over speed required releasing the need to appear impressive in any single moment, trading that appearance for something less visible but ultimately more productive over a longer stretch of continued effort. That trade paid off. What accumulated through never stopping eventually outpaced whatever speed alone could have produced in shorter, more dramatic bursts that eventually exhausted themselves. So the requirement stays simple now. Not fast, just continuous, regardless of how unremarkable that continuous movement happens to look at any single moment along the way. Perfection gets chased by plenty of people, an impossible standard that consumes enormous energy while rarely ever actually getting reached completely. That chase got abandoned. Chasing tomorrow never stopped instead. That distinction matters because perfection as a target produces constant disappointment since it remains permanently out of reach regardless of how much effort gets applied toward reaching it. Tomorrow is different entirely. It arrives reliably, regardless of whether today reached anything resembling perfection, offering another opportunity that does not require today's results to have been flawless first. Chasing tomorrow instead of perfection removed the disappointment that perfection always produces, replacing it with simple continuation that does not require flawlessness to remain valid. That continuation does not demand impossible standards. It only demands showing up again, regardless of how today actually went,
with whatever imperfection today happened to produce along the way. This shift changed everything about sustainability. Perfection burns people out eventually because it cannot ever actually be satisfied completely. Tomorrow never burns anyone out the same way because it simply keeps arriving, offering another chance regardless of whatever came before it. So tomorrow keeps getting chased indefinitely, without the impossible burden perfection always carried alongside it.
Consistency rarely gets celebrated as talent, often dismissed as simply showing up, unremarkable compared to whatever natural gift other people happen to display more visibly. Consistency was the only talent available here, and it outperformed everyone else's gift consistently over time. That outcome surprises people who assumed natural gift would always win eventually, given enough time for talent to express itself fully against less impressive competition. It rarely works that way in practice. Natural gift, without consistent application, produces flashes, impressive but inconsistent, eventually overtaken by steady, unremarkable effort applied without interruption over a longer stretch. That steady application compounds in ways flashes of brilliance never quite manage to replicate. Small, consistent gains repeated daily eventually surpass larger, inconsistent gains that depend entirely on motivation or natural ability showing up reliably. Recognizing consistency as the actual talent being relied on here changed how seriously it got protected and prioritized over time. It was never going to be flashy. It was simply going to outlast everyone relying on natural gift alone, given enough time for the compounding to actually finish doing its work.
Falling happens to everyone attempting anything difficult, regardless of skill level, regardless of preparation, regardless of how carefully every step gets planned in advance. The falling happened the same number of times as everyone else. Getting up one more time than them is what actually made the difference. That distinction removes the myth that successful people simply fall less often than everyone else attempting the same difficult thing. Most of them fall just as often. What separates outcomes is rarely the falling itself. It is the count of times getting up happened afterward, compared against however many times everyone else decided that particular fall was finally the one that ended things. That single extra rise, repeated consistently across every fall encountered along the way, is the actual mechanism behind whatever eventually got built here. Recognizing that mechanism removed the pressure to avoid falling entirely, an impossible standard nobody could actually meet anyway, replacing it with a much simpler standard instead. Get up one more time than whatever the previous fall seemed to require. That standard is achievable repeatedly, regardless of how many times it needs applying before the falling finally stops happening altogether.
Winning gets celebrated loudly, visible, easy to point toward as evidence of whatever strength produced the victory being recognized. The actual strength never lived in the win. It lived in showing up the day after the loss, when showing up felt least required. That distinction matters because wins require very little strength to celebrate properly, while losses require significant strength simply to survive without quitting entirely. Showing up after a win is easy. Momentum carries that effort forward almost automatically, requiring little beyond simply continuing whatever was already working. Showing up after a loss is different entirely.
Momentum works against continuation in that situation, making every excuse to stop feel completely justified given whatever just went wrong. That harder showing up, repeated specifically after losses rather than after wins, is where the actual strength being discussed here always lived. Recognizing that location changed where attention and effort got directed going forward, not towards celebrating wins louder, towards showing up the day after losses consistently, regardless of how unjustified that continued effort might have felt in the immediate aftermath.
Being chosen sounds like the explanation for whatever eventually succeeds, removing effort from the equation entirely in favor of some external selection process. Being chosen was never what happened here. Refusing to leave the line is what actually happened instead. That distinction removes a convenient excuse that being chosen always provides for whoever did not eventually succeed. If success requires selection, then failure to succeed simply means selection never happened, a conclusion requiring nothing further to examine honestly. If success requires simply remaining in line, regardless of selection, the entire explanation changes completely, removing the excuse entirely and replacing it with continued presence as the only actual requirement. That presence, maintained consistently, regardless of whether selection ever felt imminent or likely, produced whatever stands now, built entirely from refusal to leave, rather than from any external decision to grant access. This requires accepting that selection was never actually guaranteed or required. Presence was the only thing actually controllable, and presence is exactly what continued, day after day, regardless of whatever selection process was or was not happening externally. Repetitions happen privately, unwitnessed, contributing to whatever eventually becomes visible without anyone actually seeing the accumulation happening in real time. Every rep nobody saw is the exact reason nothing can stop this now. That invisibility matters because it explains why the eventual result often looks sudden to anyone who never witnessed the actual accumulation happening privately over time. Nobody watched every single repetition. Nobody tracked the daily, unremarkable effort that eventually compounded into whatever stands visible now, fully formed and seemingly arrived without much warning. That lack of witnesses does not diminish what those repetitions actually built. If anything, it makes the result more secure because nobody outside actually understands how deep the foundation underneath it actually goes. Recognizing that depth changes how unshakable whatever was built here actually feels from the inside. It was never built on anything visible or temporary. It was built on repetition, unwitnessed, accumulated specifically because nobody was watching closely enough to interrupt the process along the way. That foundation is permanent now, built from exactly the repetitions nobody else ever bothered to notice happening.
Shortcuts get prayed for constantly, hoped for, wished into existence by anyone hoping to skip the longer, harder path toward whatever destination is actually being pursued. No praying for shortcuts happened here. Grinding until the long way felt short is what actually happened instead. That distinction matters because shortcuts, even when found, rarely produce the same durability as the longer path actually walked completely. Wishing for shortcuts wastes energy that should be applied directly toward the longer path instead. Energy spent hoping rather than energy spent actually moving forward along whatever route is genuinely available. Grinding through the long way changes the relationship with that length entirely. What initially feels impossibly long eventually starts feeling shorter, not because the actual distance changed, but because the grinding itself built capacity that the original length never accounted for. That shift in perception is the actual reward for refusing the shortcut fantasy entirely. The long way stops feeling long once enough capacity has been built specifically through the grinding required to walk it completely. So the grinding continues, deliberately, with no remaining interest in shortcuts that were never actually going to produce anything as durable as what continued effort eventually built instead.
Empires get built quickly by some. Years compressed into rapid construction through whatever advantage allowed that speed in the first place. That speed was never available here. What got built instead happened entirely during the seconds others spent doubting it. That reframe matters because it converts doubt, something usually treated as discouraging, into actual material being used productively during its own occurrence. Every second spent doubting by anyone watching from outside was a second this continued building regardless, using exactly the time skepticism assumed was being wasted. That conversion is not accidental. It required deliberately ignoring whatever doubt suggested about the timeline, continuing to build during precisely the stretches doubt assumed nothing significant was actually happening. The empires built quickly by others used speed this never had access to. What got built here used something else entirely. Persistence applied specifically during the exact seconds doubt assumed were being wasted on something destined to fail. That persistence is still active right now, using whatever doubt continues circulating as fuel for continued construction rather than as a reason to slow down or stop.
Fearlessness gets assumed as the reason behind relentless effort, as though absence of fear is what actually drives continued persistence through difficult stretches. Relentlessness here never came from fearlessness. It came from recognizing that stopping always cost more than continuing did. That distinction matters because fear was always present, regardless of how relentless the continued effort actually looked from outside. Fear does not disappear simply because effort continues despite it. It remains constant, requiring continued effort to push through, rather than requiring its absence to begin with. What actually drove continued persistence was a clear calculation, repeated constantly, about the actual cost of stopping, compared against the cost of continuing, despite whatever fear remained present throughout the entire process. That calculation consistently favored continuing. Stopping meant losing whatever had already been built, abandoning progress that had cost significant effort to produce in the first place. Continuing, despite fear remaining fully present, cost less than that loss would have every single time the comparison actually got made honestly. So relentlessness continued, not because fear disappeared, but because the math always favored continuing, regardless of whatever fear remained present throughout the entire process.
Strength sometimes looks dramatic, visible, easy to recognize through obvious displays of capability or achievement worth celebrating openly. Some days, strength was simply refusing to lie back down. Nothing more dramatic than that single refusal. That simplicity matters because it removes the requirement that strength always look impressive to actually count as real. Some days produced nothing visible, nothing worth celebrating, nothing resembling the dramatic displays
usually associated with strength being demonstrated publicly. What those days produced instead was simply continued presence, refusing the easier option of staying down once gravity, exhaustion, or difficulty had already produced a fall. That refusal, undramatic and often unnoticed, counted exactly as much as any more visible display of strength might have, despite lacking anything resembling spectacle. Recognizing that unremarkable refusal as genuine strength changed how those quiet days got valued afterward, no longer dismissed simply because nothing dramatic happened to mark their significance. So strength continues being measured this way now, including on days that produce nothing visible beyond the simple fact of refusing to remain lying down once falling had already happened.
Applause gets used by some as the measure of actual progress, loud and immediate, confirming that whatever just happened was worth the effort required to produce it. Progress got measured in scars here instead, never in applause that rarely arrived anyway. That distinction matters because applause is unreliable, inconsistent, dependent on factors that have little to do with whatever actual progress occurred underneath it. Scars are different entirely. They are permanent, accurate, impossible to fake or exaggerate the way applause sometimes gets exaggerated by people eager to encourage continued effort, regardless of actual substance. Measuring progress through scars instead of applause produced a far more honest accounting of whatever actually happened, removing the unreliable feedback applause always provided in favor of something concrete and undeniable. Every scar represents something survived, something that actually cost real effort to get through, regardless of whether anyone clapped for it afterward or even noticed it happening at all. That measurement system continues now, ignoring whatever applause occasionally arrives in favor of the only metric that has ever actually proven reliable across everything covered so far.
Mountains stay exactly where they are, fixed, immovable, regardless of how much effort or wishing gets directed toward changing their actual position. The mountain never moved. Becoming someone capable of climbing forever happened instead. That distinction matters because waiting for an obstacle to change is far less productive than becoming capable enough to handle whatever the obstacle actually requires. Wishing the mountain would move, shrink, or somehow become easier wastes time that could otherwise be spent building the actual capacity required to climb it regardless of its fixed difficulty. That capacity took time to build. It required treating the mountain as permanent, removing any expectation that it would eventually change to accommodate whatever effort was being applied against it. Once that expectation got removed, all remaining energy went toward building climbing capacity instead, indefinitely, without any timeline depending on the mountain itself ever becoming smaller or easier. That capacity is what stands now, built specifically because the mountain refused to cooperate, forcing development of something that did not depend on the obstacle ever changing at all.
Survival sometimes gets explained backwards, as though strength came first and survival followed naturally from whatever strength already existed beforehand. Surviving was never the result of already being strong. Getting strong happened because surviving never stopped being refused. That reversal matters because it changes which comes first in the actual sequence being described here. Strength did not exist at the beginning, available to be deployed whenever survival required it. It was built, Gradually, specifically through the repeated act of refusing to stop surviving despite not yet possessing whatever strength eventually developed afterward. That sequence is uncomfortable to accept because it means strength was never actually a prerequisite for getting through anything difficult. Refusal was the prerequisite, with strength developing afterward as a consequence rather than existing beforehand as a requirement. Recognizing that sequence removes the excuse of waiting for strength before attempting to survive whatever currently feels overwhelming. Survival comes first through refusal alone, regardless of whether strength feels present yet. Strength follows afterward, built specifically through that continued refusal, rather than required beforehand to make the refusal possible.
Rejection arrives constantly in various forms, each one feeling final in the moment it gets delivered, regardless of how many times it eventually gets repeated. Every rejection was only ever practice for the eventual acceptance being built toward the entire time. That reframe matters because treating rejection as practice removes the finality it usually claims for itself the moment it gets delivered. Each rejection, taken individually, felt significant, sometimes devastating, depending on how much hope had been attached to whatever was being rejected at that particular moment. Taken collectively, across however many rejections eventually accumulated, a different pattern became visible. Each one taught something specific, adjusted something slightly, prepared for whatever eventual acceptance was actually still being built toward the entire time. That preparation was not always obvious in the moment. It became clear only afterward, looking back across the accumulated rejections, recognizing how each one contributed something useful toward whatever eventually succeeded. Recognizing that pattern now changes how every future rejection gets received, not as final, as practice, specifically for whatever acceptance is still being built toward, regardless of how many additional rejections still need processing before arrival. Talent is always the first question. People ask about it as if greatness begins there, as if nothing extraordinary has ever been built without it. But persistence never cared about talent. Persistence only asked one thing: show up one more time. That has always been the difference. Strength was built on the nights you refused to quit, not overnight, one decision at a time. Doors were never opened by talent alone. They were forced open by relentless return. The last person still working after everyone else went home rarely started with the greatest gift. Failure was postponed. Defeat was never accepted. Movement mattered more than speed. Tomorrow mattered more than perfection. Consistency became the talent that outperformed every natural advantage. One more rise than every fall. One more attempt than every excuse. One more lesson than every mistake. Real strength was never measured by winning. It was measured by showing up after losing. Presence replaced potential. Repetition replaced promises. The work no one witnessed became the foundation no one could shake. The long road only looked impossible until you refused to leave it. Every second spent doubting yourself became a second stolen from building yourself. Relentlessness was never fearlessness. It was deciding the cost of quitting was greater than the cost of continuing. On the quiet days, when nobody was watching, when nothing seemed to change, strength was measured by one decision alone: stay standing. The scars mattered more than the applause. The mountain never became smaller. You simply became the kind of person who could keep climbing. Survive first,
Become stronger afterward. Treat rejection as repetition. Treat setbacks as training. Treat every obstacle as another reason to return. Everything comes back to the same requirement. Show up. Then show up again. Not because it's easy, not because you're gifted, not because you're guaranteed to win, but because the next attempt cannot happen unless this one does. That has always been persistence. One more step, one more rep, one more day. Now, prove you'll do it again.